Hey, welcome to the Safe Space channel, where we create a safe space to talk about some of the more difficult parts of being a Jehovah's Witness. I'm your host, Chris Harris, and I have a special guest today, my younger brother, Seth. Thanks for being here, Seth.
Yeah, for sure.
We thought we would have a conversation about our experiences being Jehovah's Witnesses and how that led us down different life paths. So, Seth, if you want to kick it off, and would you mind just starting by telling us a little bit about your experience growing up as a Jehovah's Witness?
Um, well, when I was younger, I have a different perspective now than I did when I was younger. But when I was a kid, there were good things about it, but there were a lot of things about it I didn't necessarily like. With our dad being an elder, and our mom always, like, her dream was to be a pioneer, and she wanted all of us to pioneer. There was a lot of pressure to always be a certain type of way, to act a certain type of way, and all that. And I was always interested in other things like playing football and all of that you weren't allowed to do. So that made it difficult for me because most of the things I was really interested in were things that were not allowed. So um, as time went on, I started to become more, I guess, rebellious and whatnot. But overall, I think we had a pretty good childhood. I mean, there was, like, Dad always being the theocratic ministry school overseer and us always giving talks like that. There's good experiences there. But overall, I got to a point later on as a teenager where I just couldn't wait to get away.
Yeah, that seems like that's a pretty common experience, especially as people reach their teen years. And so, growing up, like, talk a little bit about like when you started being a publisher and getting on the school. Speaking of the theocratic ministry school, as it was called back then,
Mm-hmm.
and what led up ultimately to your baptism.
So I started giving talks when I was 5. I was either 5 or 6. I was really young. They would have to take the top part of the podium off and give me a stool to stand on because I was too short. And so that was back. I can't remember when I became a publisher exactly. 6 or 7 years old, maybe 8 years old, something like that.
Yeah, I think if I remember correctly, we actually became publishers at the same time,
Yeah, I think
and
so too. And we were,
and I was 7, so you must have
yeah,
been 5 or 6.
yeah, yeah. And then leading up to baptism, I mean, when I was that young, for sure, I believed in everything because when you're that young, it's all you know, and you're always told that it's the truth, and so that's what you believe. And leading up to baptism, I was baptized on my 12th birthday. And it was like a
Okay.
year and a half after you, I think. You were baptized in 96. I was baptized in 97. And
Oh,
leading up to that, if you actually remember, so I mean, there was always, to me, like, there was no question that I was going to be baptized at that age. It was sort of like a rite of passage in a way. And then also there was some competition amongst, well, I felt competitive, at least amongst other guys in the congregation that were my age and our friends and stuff. You wanted to be the first person to get baptized or whatever. It was kind of I don't know. It was also a way to get more responsibility. And it was sort of like the way you become a man and that sort of thing. You got to be baptized. And so there was always that in the back of my mind. But I think I really sped up my desire to become baptized. If you remember, like 6 months before I was baptized, we were on our way we were all piling in the van to go to a convention. I can't remember. It wasn't district. I can't remember which convention it was.
one
What's
of
the other one?
one of the circuit assemblies or
Yeah, I
something.
think it was a circuit assembly. And we're all piling into the van, and Dad announced to us that our older brother wasn't coming with us and he was moving out of the house. He had just turned 18 and he was no longer in the truth, and that sort of thing. And Mom was devastated. And for like those 2 or 3 days of the assembly, she cried the entire time. And me at 11 years old, I felt bad. I was known back then as sort of a mama's boy. And I hated seeing her like that. I didn't like seeing her so sad. So I knew I was going to get baptized, but I wanted to more than at that point because I wanted her to be happy again, I suppose, and have a little bright spot in a dark time that she was going through. And so that's when I really decided, okay, I'm just going to pull the trigger now and start talking about it now. And that's when I went to Dad and asked him, do you think I could get baptized soon? And I think at that point, I remember they held you and our sister back from getting baptized for a little while.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if it was because of what had happened with our brother, that for me, even though I was so young, they were like, yeah, go ahead. Because they wanted another one to be, dedicated to this or whatever.
Yeah,
And
that
so
could be.
that's what pushed it forward for me, and just said, okay, I'm going to do this now.
Gotcha. Yeah, and our older brother was never baptized. He was. I wish I could ask him about it on how he determined that it wasn't the truth and why he didn't go that route. But that's on another tangent.
Yeah.
But yeah, so you became a publisher at like 5 or 6, and you could read fluently
Mm-hmm.
at that time. And so I think like right after you became a publisher, you joined the school.
Yeah.
And started giving number 2 talks as they were formatted back then. You would read a portion of scriptures and then give sort of a body type.
Yeah, the format was always introduction, read the Bible reading for the week, and then do an outro.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
I had to do number 2s until I think you had to be baptized to give number 4s. I didn't give a number 4 talk until I was maybe 12 or 13, something like that. But I always enjoyed the number 4 talks a little bit more because it wasn't just an intro and then a certain set of scriptures. You could kind of go pick what you wanted, and you got to talk more rather than just read.
Yeah. And I think you're right. That rings a bell. I think they didn't really use you for 4s until you were baptized. But then once you were baptized, and you're right. So I was baptized in 96 in Boise, and they did ask me to wait a year because at 11 I said I was ready, and they asked me to wait a year, and then gave me the go ahead. And so after you were baptized, though, then you took on some responsibilities, and we were in a very small congregation. So I think we were probably exposed to responsibilities that maybe we wouldn't have been if we were in a larger congregation. But
sure.
what were some of the things that you did?
I think I initially started on the sound and working on the sound, which I always enjoyed. Actually, the first thing was running the microphones. And that was kind of a big deal too. I don't know why. I guess it was because you got to stand up and move, and you weren't just sitting there the whole time. And I enjoyed handing out the microphones. I thought that was always cool. Gave me something to do, and it was a little more interactive then, as opposed to just sitting there the whole time. Working the sound was fun. I don't think I ever did the literature counter. I know you did the literature counter quite a bit. But for me, it was mostly microphones, sound, and giving talks. And I remember even at that age, we would go out and service. We'd do the service meeting in the very beginning. And it was always weird to me because Mom would actually, sometimes there was nobody else there. I was baptized, but still maybe too young to lead the service meeting. So she would do it, but she'd have to put the scarf on over her head and all that. And I thought that was I was like, this is weird. Just because I'm here and I'm baptized and I'm the only one there, and I'm like 12 years old. But then I ended up leading the service meeting a couple of times here and there and stuff. So that was probably the extent of my responsibilities, really.
Gotcha. Yeah. That sounds familiar. Yeah. And I always thought the head covering thing was definitely weird, especially like when we would go on studies with her.
Yeah.
And she would still wear a scarf or a hat or something.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
It was always kind of awkward, felt awkward. So then as you got to maybe more into your later teen years, so you were handling the sound and whatnot until how old do you think you were when you stopped doing that?
I was 16.
16? Okay.
Yeah.
And then so what were some of the things that led you down your life path?
Well, there was actually one thing that hit me pretty hard. I think I was probably 13 or 14, maybe. You remember how our parents would get together with their friends from the congregation. They'd all play pinochle, and that was like their thing. And they had a pinochle game up at grandma's house. And I don't remember why I was there. I was only there for a little bit, but they were all there talking about the changes that they had seen in the organization over all the years that they had been in. And we're talking people that had been in for 50 years. And I remember there was something that hit me when one of the sisters there mentioned 1975, and grandma's face. There's something about her face where she like leans back and was like, "Oh yes, 1975." And she wasn't happy about it. And I thought that was really interesting. So it was maybe a couple of days later, I think Dad and I were watching Monday Night Football or something. And I asked him about it. And he kind of played it down a little bit. And he said, "Oh, that was some brothers then got way ahead of themselves," or something like that, and said that Armageddon was going to happen in 1975. And I thought, okay, I'd never heard that before. I think this was the first time, at least the first time, that it ever clicked to me that something had been said and then changed. And I never really shook that from that point on. I kind of became really sensitive to any sort of changes because this is supposed to be the truth. But the truth doesn't just change. So how does that change? How are they wrong if they're really getting their information from God and all of that? So as time went on, any sort of like new light that came about or whatever, I was really unsure of. And I thought, no, you don't just change things. It's actually kind of like when you buy a car, you buy a Toyota Corolla, and now everywhere you go, you see Toyota Corollas going around,
Yeah.
Well, I had just bought a 1975 failed prophecy, and I was seeing the same thing. It didn't matter what year it was, a new year, a new model. But now I'm seeing like false prophecies or wrong beliefs all over the place whenever new things would happen or change. And so that really started me down a path of, I don't think this is the truth. Like, you can't just change it. And it just kind of snowballed really I was probably 14 at the time. And from 14 to 16, I just got to the point where I really, especially at 16, I was like, I don't believe this anymore. And that's how I ended up there. And then things kind of came to a head at that point, and, had to have the conversations with the parents. And I was trying to get out of going to meetings and whatnot. But it all came down to just realizing that what I'm saying is the truth now, I probably won't say is the truth in 10 years. Mm-hmm. And I didn't like that. There was also Mom's thing. I remember I was behind the counter, and I was working the sound, and I think it was a Tuesday night meeting or something, the Theocratic Ministry School. And she was saying kind of loudly and sort of proudly, she said, "I don't even know who the members of the governing body are." And that one kind of hit me too. And I thought, wait a minute, I don't know who they are either. So how can we really trust everything that they're saying when we don't even know who they are at all? Because there was no jw.org back then. Mm-hmm. And there was no, like, they weren't on any videos giving talks or any of that stuff. You never saw them. You never heard of them. And back then it was kind of a sign of your faith that you just believed without knowing any of them or their backgrounds or where they come from. And so it was a lot of little things like that, but it was definitely the 1975 thing that got me first.
Gotcha. Yeah, it's funny. So critical thinking really started kicking in for you at a pretty young age.
Yeah.
Whereas for me, and just to go back a little bit, we were both born in third generation on both sides of our family. So, our grandparents on both sides were witnesses. Mm-hmm. And then we have all the uncles and aunts and cousins. And so for me, it was more like this is just what we know, and everybody around us is doing it. So it must be the truth because these are smart people that, mm-hmm. That are doing this. And so, yeah, I never had that at that point in life. I had never had that critical thinking piece kick in to where I was questioning anything. It was just more of a automatic acceptance type of
Yeah.
situation. And so, so what did your exit look like?
It was kind of long and drawn out, really. Um, by the time I was 16, it was the summer before I turned 17. I got into a point where I just couldn't give talks anymore because it was all fake. I didn't believe it, and I just couldn't do it anymore. And I had actually started drinking around this time. Well, even before that, I started drinking, but I was drinking vodka because I knew that you couldn't smell it as much as you could other liquors.
Hmm.
And you could probably guess who was supplying me with the liquor at that time. There was actually a couple of people,
Yeah.
but I was actually sort of pre-gaming the meetings. I was drinking a little bit before I go to the meetings, get a little buzz just to sit through it, just to get through it. And then I found out it's actually kind of fun giving talks when you're sort of buzzed. As disrespectful as that seems now, I was actually I would go to the bathroom and I'd take my little bottle of vodka out and go to the bathroom and take a couple shots and then go give a talk. And I was like, okay, that's actually makes it a little more fun. But then I got to the point where I was like, I can't do this forever, and I'm just not interested in it anymore. So I started to try and make excuses to skip out on meetings, which the parents obviously notice. And then finally, I think I was working somewhere on a farm or something on a Tuesday or Thursday night. And I told the parents I'm going to be late. I'll head to meeting once I get home. And they said, it was kind of like you better, sort of message that they gave me. You better be to meeting because you've been skipping out on a lot of them. And I just didn't go. I went home and I just played video games. So by the time they got home, they were pretty upset with me. And then we had to have a conversation. And that's when I was just like, I'm done. Honestly, I can't do this anymore. And then there was the problem that was, well, you're living in our house, so you have to go to meetings. And you're not old enough to move out on your own, so you don't really have a choice. And I was pretty combative at that age, and I was just didn't want to do any of that. So we definitely had some pretty tough conversations. And Dad told me he would take me to get me emancipated. And I said, okay, well, let's go. I'll get my shoes on. And Mom was like, no, that's not happening. So I ended up telling him, I think our older brother was going to move out into his own apartment because he'd been living with us for a little bit. And he was going to move out. And so I told him, I'm going to go with him and I'll just move out. And they said, okay, which was a terrible idea. I mean, he was a drug addict and an alcoholic, but it was better as far as they were concerned, I think, for me to go experience that side of things, the terrible side, the non-witness side of life, and maybe hopefully change my mind to come back. So that didn't happen, but I ended up moving out, and living with him wasn't necessarily the greatest thing. It was, I did watch him. I saw him overdose, which was not a good thing. And then he ended up having to spend, I think he went back to our parents' house and slept for like 3 days straight. And around that time, they decided that they were going to move, our parents. And Mom told me, you can either come with us, but you're going to have to go to meetings and go out in service and whatnot, or you can stay with your brother and go wherever he goes. And I said, okay, I'll go with you guys. By this time, I already knew I was going to join the military. So, because this is shortly after 9/11, and I wanted the stability, and I decided, okay, I'll go with you guys. I'll stick it out, and I'll just go to the meetings and do what I got to do. I only had like a year till I turned 18. So we moved, and then I kept doing what I had to do until finally I was able to leave. And I had knee surgery at 18. So that kind of set me back a little bit. But then I moved back to Idaho. And from that point on, I was on my own. I was doing my own thing. I was preparing to join the Army and just getting ready to go. And that was it.
And that was your escape route?
That was the escape route. It was a stepping stone, really. I wanted to just go out and experience life on my own, but I knew I needed something. I knew I needed a way out. It was really the quickest and cleanest way to just cut everything off, get out of the state. Because otherwise I didn't really have much prospects. I could stay, and I was working in construction at the time, which was fine, but it's not necessarily what I wanted to do forever. So it was just, yeah, it was the cleanest sort of escape that I could think of.
Yeah.
And it made sense. It was also right around the time that Iraq had been invaded. I knew I would be deployed. There was something about that I wanted to do. So felt kind of a natural calling to that, and it made sense. So that was, I thought, yeah, it hit me when I was like 16, that's what I'm going to do.
Gotcha. And yeah, because Dad had the painting business,
Mm-hmm.
but then you would have been stuck working for him, which would have been awkward. And then basically all of the people in construction that we knew were witnesses.
Mm-hmm.
It's such a small area. Like you said, there weren't many prospects for a way out.
Yeah. And when I had moved back to Idaho, I worked for one of the guys in the congregation who was super cool. He knew everybody in the congregation knew that I wasn't really a witness anymore, but I wasn't disfellowshipped yet. And so he kind of took me under his wing, and he was super cool. He understood. He had previously been disfellowshipped before as well. So he kind of knew what it was like. And his grandson and our brother, were best friends, and they weren't witnesses either. And so he was just a super cool guy. He was actually the only person that I told that I was going to leave, and kind of knew what my plan was. And he actually hooked me up with a van. And so I had some freedom because I was able to drive around town and whatnot. And so he was a super cool guy, but there was no way that I was going to stay there amongst everybody that I knew and grew up with my entire life and try to find a way. And I didn't even want to go to the next town over. I needed to get out.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, it's such a small area anyway.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, even if you go to one of the next towns, it's so tiny. You're gonna run into people.
Everybody there too.
Yeah, and then questions are asked, so yeah, so that makes sense that was your escape route, to just completely get out of the area. And in the meantime, I think, as we were navigating that situation, you and I had, and I think Mom was there too, you and I had a final conversation before you left. And I was so mentally in that it was kind of cringy how indoctrinated mentally I was. But what was our last conversation like?
It was kind of funny because I had actually mentioned to you the same thing that I thought myself when I told you. I said something like, in 20 years, you're not going to believe the things that you believe now. And you said, "Get behind me, Satan," which is a pretty famous line. You'd actually used that before. And I was like, wow, okay, now I'm Satan. Gotcha. But I also understood in a way. I mean, I was angry about some things, but I also understood everybody were believers much more than I was. And I never anticipated that you would leave. Like, the fact that you're here now is actually crazy to me still.
Really?
Because, yeah, I mean, you had mentioned, I remember watching your interview with Mitch, XJW, and you mentioned that you were always known as the goody two-shoe of the kids, like just never took a foot wrong. And that was so true. I actually, I don't know if you remember, but I had a nickname for you back then, and it was Jehovah's Boy. And that was never...
Say it again. You cut out there for a second.
Oh, I always called you Jehovah's Boy.
Oh God, I absolutely completely forgot about that.
Yeah,
but yeah, now that you mentioned that, I remember.
Yeah, and we were always. It's funny because we're the closest in age out of all of our siblings, but we were so different personality wise. And so I understood why you were, taking the stance that you took. It's also like you're supposed to, because if you don't, then everybody's going to have to sort of shun you too and not have anything to do with you. But yeah, those were some hard conversations that we had. I just had to stand on business, I guess, and
Do
stick
what
with
you're
what I
gonna
thought
do.
was right. Yeah. I had
Yeah.
no other choice.
Yeah, and it's kind of funny that so you would have been about 18 at that time or close to it.
Yeah.
And then so when were you actually deployed? When did you leave?
I left. So I was disfellowshipped in September of 2004, and I left in November of 2004. It was like 2 weeks after my 19th birthday, and I was gone. And I had already planned on being gone. So being disfellowshipped wasn't necessarily the worst thing in the world to me. I was disfellowshipped for something I actually didn't do, which I thought was interesting. But there were plenty of other things that I was doing that I thought, well, there's some disfellowshippable offenses going on here. So whatever, it's no big deal. But then by the time because I had like 6 weeks, I think, between then and when I left, that it wasn't the end of the world to me. I was like, well, I'm leaving anyway, so no big deal. And I remember getting on the airplane to go to Fort Benning, Georgia, and the airplane took off, and I just felt this huge weight come off of my shoulders. And I thought, finally, the point that I wanted to be for so long, I was there, and I was going to go make life happen on my own, and it felt great.
Nice. Yeah, it's funny because at about that time, so we obviously split off into different directions, and it was about that exact same time where the elders were talking about appointing me a ministerial servant, and I don't know that I could really tell you why I declined at that time, but I think it had something to do with being an elder, because obviously that's the natural progression. And like you said, Dad was an elder. Our uncles were elders, and we had one that lived, close by that was well known in the circuit. And so there's a lot of pressure there. But for some reason, I didn't really want to do that. And just being on judicial committees, or the thought of being on a judicial committee where you're controlling somebody's life and their family and friend relationships, just really rubbed me wrong even back then. And so at that time I declined, and I skipped over it, and I just said something like, well, maybe after a little bit more time I'll want to do that. And so I held off. But then again, when I was 25, they talked about, I had moved back to Idaho, and they had talked about wanting to, kind of coach me into being a ministerial servant. And then it was about that time that I was thinking about getting married. And so I declined again. Not that they didn't offer it at that time, but they were really wanting me to reach out for that. And so I just said, well, actually, I don't think it's really a good idea because I'm going to be moving anyway. So I moved away, and I never actually reached out or became appointed. But during that whole time, I was still very mentally in. Like, I wasn't questioning 1975, even though Dad and I had some conversations about it. And I didn't really understand 1914. I was just like, well, they know what they're doing and everybody else accepts it. So, it was just an automatic acceptance. And then when the governing body made any changes, which weren't really very big or very often back then.
No, not really.
But when they did make changes, I just accepted it as, okay, they know what they're doing.
Do you think that hurt you a little bit, not picking up a ministerial servant when you could have? Like, do you think it kind of put doubts in other people's minds and kind of marked you a little bit?
I didn't seem to suffer any negative repercussions from that.
There wasn't like he's bad association, don't hang out with him kind of a thing or anything like that.
No, no. And I think primarily because I was auxiliary pioneering a lot at that time, and I had other responsibilities. So by that time, you probably remember I was also learning American Sign Language, and even before then. So like I think I started doing that when I was like 15.
Yeah, you were fluent in ASL pretty fast.
Yeah, I spent a lot of time with that family and learned it pretty quickly. And so I was doing the sign language interpretation for meetings, and then they asked me to do it for the circuit assemblies and the district conventions as well.
Yeah, I remember that.
And then we even started creating territories for deaf witnessing, and then that eventually led to a group being formed in Emmett for sign language. And so I had that responsibility plus the sound. I was doing literature. I was auxiliary pioneering. So I don't think nobody really questioned it, and I didn't really talk about it much either, that I was being recommended or that they wanted to recommend me. So I don't remember any negative repercussions from that, probably because I was so busy with other stuff too,
that makes sense.
The performance was there in some regard, you know what I mean?
Yeah, and you were contributing in a big way, but in a different way. Because I remember you at the assemblies and whatnot doing the ASL, and there actually came to be a pretty big group of people that you were interpreting for.
Yeah, I think at one of the final ones that I interpreted for, we had 25 or so.
Yeah.
In that section of the assembly, and then when it broke off to Emmett, then that's kind of when I started backing away from it and let it go. And then what's funny is there was another brother that was a ministerial servant and regular pioneer in Hillsboro that I was friends with, that I don't remember how it happened, but he was asked, I think, to move to Emmett to lead the ASL congregation. And so he moved over to Emmett, and then was part of the deaf congregation for a while, and was appointed an elder. And then he was also used in other congregations around Boise. But what's really funny about that is I was watching YouTube a couple days ago, and all of a sudden a video from him popped up on my, the For You page. And it was about his exit. And I had no idea. I didn't know that he left. And so anyway, we've reconnected and talked about that a little bit.
Oh, nice. That's cool.
That was funny. It was just kind of a full circle type of deal.
Reconnecting with all kinds of people now that left.
Yeah.
So that's crazy.
And just getting to know the reasons. But so you went off to the military and spent some time there. And then what did things look like after you got out? Did you ever have a pull back to the organization, or were you just completely free and happy at that point?
There was sort of a pull in a way. So back I was active duty for 5 years. Towards the end of my time there, I got back from my second deployment, and my wife wanted to back up a little bit further. I was married at 20 years old. My wife and I have known each other since we were 14, and we met through your wife's family, and because your wife's dad traveled and met people. And I remember them coming back with pictures of her when I was like 14. I thought, man, she's cute. I need to introduce myself. And then finally I ended up being stationed in Colorado, where she was then living, and we met up and started dating and all that. And fast forward a little bit, we got married. So we knew each other because we had both grown up in the same organization, and she had more of a pull to go back than I did. And we decided to go back to meetings at a congregation there in Colorado. And I remember sitting there hearing the comments and going through the literature. It was like always Sundays, and we had to sit in the back because she was disfellowshipped too. she got disfellowshipped for marrying me. And it was more of a confirmation of like, no, I made the right choice when I left, because there's no way I could go back to this. And I knew that for sure. So I told her, no, it's not for me. And it took a little while for her. She ended up going back in, which could probably be a whole other 5-hour conversation, how that went. She's out now. But yeah, she went back in for about 7 years. And that was right around the time that our daughter was born, which to me made sense. You know, she wanted our kids to be raised with the same sort of moral foundation that we were. And it was what she knew and was familiar with. So I supported her in that at least. But then as the kids got older and there were sort of differences between, I want to celebrate their birthdays and she doesn't, sort of thing, you know, there were issues there. And finally it kind of came to a head where I told her, I can't do this anymore. We're going to have to be on the same page. We can't be a divided family. And I didn't bring this into the relationship. I've been the same since we got married. So something's going to have to change. And she, for the first time, mentioned to me that she had doubts, and we talked about them, and she decided to try to go a different way. So she did, and it worked out well for us. But as far as ever going back, I tried, I guess. I mean, I didn't really try, but I was more curious, and I thought, well, now that I think I was 23 at the time, I had quite a bit of life experience. I had traveled around the world, done things that I had never really, I'd done all the things I wanted to do, I guess. And I thought, yeah, this would be interesting to see what my perspective is now, as opposed to being a 16-year-old kid. And then it was just more of I solidified the fact that it's not for me, and I don't believe it, and there's no way I can do this. So it was actually good to go back. I think I went to meetings for maybe 2 or 3 months straight. And then I was like, nope, no more.
So what about when you had your daughter, were there any thoughts in your mind about, you know, saving her, or that was the way to salvation, was back in the organization, or were there any thoughts like that, or how did having children affect you?
There was never any thought like that for me, not at that point. To me, it was more like I knew what she was going to be exposed to with my wife going back in. And so my mentality was I need to save her from the organization than anything else, because I know what she's going to be learning. I know that as far as I was concerned, none of it's right or true. So that's what caused a lot of friction too in our marriage. But I spent more time paying attention to what was being taught in the meetings. And at this time, there was a lot more online that you could research and get into than there was when I was a kid. So there were actually people on YouTube that were ex-witnesses talking about their experiences, and I was watching a lot of those. And this is probably going back to 2013 or so, and she was maybe 2 years old when I started finding all this stuff. So when my wife would take the kids to meeting, I would be at home watching all the YouTube videos on what was going on at the meetings. And this was right around the time that JW Ward got started, and the governing body was definitely much more out there, out front and center. So I could watch them, get to know who they were. And that made it even more obvious that this is not, it's crazy watching some of the talks that the governing body members gave. And I just became more, not necessarily obsessed, but I wanted to know what they were learning, when they were learning it. And even though they were so young, it didn't really affect them that much. Probably not until they were like 5, 6 years old did they say things that I didn't necessarily like. And I realized the indoctrination might be taking hold here. And that's when it kind of set off an alarm in my brain.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense. So, yeah, that's interesting, because a lot of times when witnesses, or even even if they've been disfellowshipped or have left, when they have children, a lot of times it'll be like, oh no, now I have another life I'm responsible for, and I need to,
Mhm.
get them back into it. So that's really interesting how that went.
No, I actually went a really hardcore sort of atheist route, and
Interesting.
stayed that way for a long time. There's that old saying that there's no such thing as an atheist in a foxhole, and that's not true. It didn't matter what happened to me or how bad any of the experiences I had in Iraq. I was an atheist till the end, as far as I was concerned. And so I went the exact opposite way, and I was getting into all of the evolution stuff and everything else, and that became like my core belief in a way, and the idea that God didn't exist and all of that. And so there was no way that I was going to go back, and that lasted for a long time, really up until probably like 3 or 4 years ago.
Gotcha. Yeah, it does make you completely reevaluate, like what do I believe? What do I think about this,
Mm-hmm.
this whole situation? So
It definitely gives you a lot of freedom to explore. And but I was also, like, back then I was angry and wanted to go the exact opposite way, which I think happens to a lot of people
mhm.
when you grow up in that. And I've noticed that a lot of people will leave, they'll become atheists, get into evolutionary stuff, and kind of springboard into all of that, because it really isn't any other option as far as life is concerned. When you're a witness, you're either in all the way and you believe it all the way, or you're out and you're a persona non grata, and you've got to go. Like, what do you do with everything that you believed when you no longer believe it anymore?
Yeah. Yeah, and there are some people that pretend, that sit on both sides of the fence, but I just can't imagine how difficult that would be. And of course it's understandable because they want to keep their friends and family relationships, but that must be a really tough spot to be in. And
Yeah, the
so,
physically in, mentally out.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I can't imagine that.
And um so during that time, I mean, we had maybe had one or two conversations over the phone. I
Hmm.
remember you called a couple of times just to check in, which was fine. To be completely honest, even then, if you had called more, I would have answered the phone. I would have talked to you.
Yeah.
Um, but it was more of a, if I reached out, then I'm doing something rebellious.
Oh,
But
that
if
makes
I
sense.
receive a call, then it's like, oh, maybe there's something I need to know, or something going on that, and so I would always answer it. But we hadn't really had any meaningful conversations for what, like 18 years,
Yeah.
19 years.
Yeah. A couple of, like, check-ins here and there. And I
Yeah.
do remember when I had moved to Oregon, you were living on the Oregon coast. We would go out all the time and kind of explore a lot of different places in Oregon. And I said, hey, we want to swing by your area. Would you want to meet up and hang out? And you said, I don't think that's a really good idea. I think if you guys are going to swing by, come by, have fun, but we're going to do our own thing. And I said something like, shunning me isn't going to make me want to be a witness anymore. And you said, no, it's not about shunning. It's about doing what I have to do that I think is right, or whatever. And I said, okay, I kind of just wrote it out. It was the same thing, but I thought maybe after all that time, something had changed. But then I realized it didn't. So I was always cool with you, though. I mean, you could keep your distance if you wanted to, but
Yeah,
it
and
wasn't too big of a deal.
I don't remember that at all.
No,
No.
it was.
That's
I think we were actually texting.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
uh, yeah. The things we do when we're indoctrinated.
yeah,
Holy shit. But then, so if we fast forward, because you and your wife, then were completely out, right? At what point would you say that she was finally done with it?
This was the end of 2018.
2018. Okay.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
before COVID even
Mm-hmm.
happened,
Yeah.
because I know
Before
that
COVID.
COVID caused a pretty gnarly wave of people waking up.
Yeah.
And you know what's interesting about that? So in 2018, we moved back to Idaho because mom was there was something not right, but they hadn't figured it out yet. But dad
Mm-hmm.
knew he was going to need some help, so we made the decision to move back to Idaho. And we thought we would just help them temporarily, and then we were gonna, since I worked remotely, we were just gonna do some traveling for a while. But then mom fell and broke her arm, and then ultimately was diagnosed with ALS. And so then we stayed full time and helped out with that. And as that, even after mom passed away in October of 2019, and then COVID broke out like the beginning of 2020, and we were so busy with what had happened with mom and then now dad, and dad was in his mid 70s,
Mm-hmm.
so he was having trouble anyway, so he required a lot of assistance. And so 2017 was actually the last district convention that we attended in person, and then we just started joining the link with mom and dad and watching with them. And so we actually didn't go back to another convention or an assembly in person. We just would join dad on that. And then I was still going in service and still attending meetings to a degree, but more so on Zoom with dad. And then my wife just checked out. I didn't really know it at that time, but she was mentally out.
Yeah.
And so then moving forward to 2022, then I had been sick for like 10 months and didn't understand what was going on. Um, and then ultimately was diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma. And then how did you hear about that?
I heard about it through our younger sister.
Hmm.
She called me and told me, she said, "Did you hear about Chris?" And I said, "No. What's going on?" She told me he was diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma. And I think she had heard from our older sister. And I was like, holy crap, that's crazy. So I knew it was like, for me, it was, I got to give him a call and talk to him about it, see how he's doing.
Yeah. And so you did.
Mm-hmm.
You called. We had a good conversation, and I remember you saying something to the effect that, well, I know you've got a lot of support over there, but
Mm-hmm.
just wanted to call and see if you needed anything, or how you're doing with it and whatever. And I was like, actually, I haven't heard from anybody.
Yeah,
Um,
that blew my mind
yeah, because we
because I
had
was like,
known, how
yeah,
long have we known everybody there?
I mean, really our entire lives, almost our entire childhoods for sure.
Yeah, and at that point I was 38, and so I thought, man, I'm gonna have all kinds of support. And I even told the oncology team, oh no, I've got tons of support. I don't need anything. And then yeah, there wasn't a phone call or a text message or a visit or anything. And so when you called, I thought it was so ironic. I was like, here I am, this brotherhood that's supposed to be the most loving brotherhood on the planet, isn't even reaching out or checking in to see how I'm doing or my wife is doing, or any of that. But my disfellowship brother calls
Mm-hmm.
and it's like, hey, what do you need? And
Yeah.
and so that was kind of interesting how that played out, because the following month after my diagnosis, I also was laid off from my job, and I was the primary income, and they laid off almost 50% of the company very quickly. And so then I was like, what am I going to do here? And you're running a side sort of business in tree stump removal.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're like, hey, come over, let's figure out a plan. We'll get it figured out and see what we need to do to make sure you guys stay afloat. And so, yeah, even at that time I was kind of uncomfortable with it,
Yeah.
but at the same time I was like, well, nobody over here cares. These
Yeah.
people that I've known all of my life don't seem to care. So, screw it. I'm going to go over there. And so that was an interesting sort of mental shift.
Yeah, that was so crazy to me that when you told me I was the only person that called you, because I was thinking when I'd call you, you'd be like, what do I need your help for? I got everybody else, but there was no way I wasn't going to call you and at least say, hey, if you need anything, let me know. And then you called me and told me, well, now I lost my job. I was like, man, it was like one thing after another. And that's when I just said, man, you got to get out of there. Come out and let me show you a good time and take your mind off of things, because obviously things had taken a downhill turn real fast and real hard. So let's just come out and have some fun. And we did. We had a blast when you came out.
Yeah, that was awesome. Got on some four-wheelers, went shooting.
Yeah.
Talked about what was going to be next, and and ultimately I was able to get on the stump removal, and that kept us afloat for a long time until I got another job. So that was, I was like, wait, is Jehovah blessing me through my disfellowshipped brother? What is happening?
Yeah.
But yeah, that was an interesting time, because it didn't necessarily make me question anything so much as it was just more of a mental shift to maybe I need to be more open-minded. Maybe I need to stop looking at things quite so black and white. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And then when I went over to visit, we even had a conversation about the organization, and you were like, if that's what you want to do, that's great. If you need a ride to a meeting, I'll take you to a meeting. If that's your belief system, it wasn't a problem for you. And I was trying to determine, is this a problem for me? And I was like, maybe I need to loosen up. Maybe I need to not be so strict in my way of thinking.
That makes sense.
But so, and then even then, it wasn't for a couple of years after that, almost 2 years exactly after that I finally I woke up. And it wasn't even, it was kind of accidental. I didn't set out to question anything or to research anything. I was more just curious how the organization dealt with court cases, and so I was looking at some of the CSA court cases that came up, and then that ultimately led me to the Australian Royal Commission. And I was like, oh, this is exactly what I'm looking for. I want to see how they deal with this, and it'll strengthen my faith in the organization and the governing body. And I binge watched all 8 days of it. And I can imagine, like, if there was a camera on me after I was done with that 8th day, I was just like,
yeah, the Australian Royal Commission is a doozy.
There was so much that came out of that for me.
Yeah.
And so I think I text you or something, and I was like, dude, I think this is all fake.
And
I even
shocked me.
Really? Yeah. I went to my wife and I was like, what if all of this is fake? And she was so relieved that I said that, because she never thought I would ever leave. She didn't even know, I don't think, that I was looking at anything, or because it wasn't like a big deal to me. It was just a curiosity type of thing. And then I text you and I was like, dude, I think there's something wrong here.
Well, it's kind of like what you said, because for a long time, going back to when the Australian Royal Commission was happening, it was like, why shouldn't witnesses watch this? Because if you're talking about the truth, then it should stand up to a really high form of scrutiny, and that's what was happening. And then you watch it and you hear like Jeffrey Jackson sort of deny the fact that the governing body is the mouthpiece or they're the spokesman for God to people on earth. And he says, no, we're not the only ones. That's a kind of a mind-blowing thing, I think, for any witnesses to hear.
Yeah.
Because
it amazes me how many current JWs defend that. Because for me, it was like that. It was I think at that moment where I was just like, and I said, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
And it was like a slap awake. Like I wasn't expecting it to happen. It just, and I felt okay watching it because it wasn't apostate information,
Yeah.
It was the elders, circuit overseers, branch coordinators, legal department overseers, the governing body member, like you said, Jeffrey Jackson was there. So, and I was just like, wow, they just did an incredible job of incriminating themselves with the fact that this isn't actually the truth. So anyway, then after that, then I was just like, okay, I think I'm ready to do some additional research.
Oh, you're there?
Yep.
Okay. I think the stream crashed there for a minute.
Oh, okay. You froze for a minute?
Yeah, I think so.
Oh, okay. So yeah, anyway, I was just saying, so from that point, after I watched that, then I was like, I think I need to do some additional research on this because that just totally blew me away.
What did you do additional research on? Like, what was your first thing that you thought, I need to look into this?
I don't know that I had a specific subject so much as then I was more curious, what are other people saying? And so then I stumbled across a YouTube channel called The Falling Tower. I think his name is Matt. He was a former elder. And when I watched his video, it wasn't the angry, argumentative, bitter apostate that we're taught that they are.
That you would expect.
Yeah. He was just calmly talking about some various subjects about being an elder, and I think he covered 1914 and then disfellowshipping and how the organization condemned the Catholic Church in 1947 for having an communication policy. And then 5 years later in 1952, then the organization puts disfellowshipping in place. And I didn't know that.
Yeah.
And so as I was picking up on things, and I verified it as I went too, I was like, is that really true? And so then I would search jw.org and compare it. And so as I started seeing more, I was like, well, I wonder what else I'm missing. Or what else I don't know. And so then 1914 did eventually pop into my head, and I went on a deep dive for that.
When you say 1914, are you talking about the generation that would never, or the generation wouldn't pass before Armageddon and the new system came?
Yeah, and even how they got to 1914, I wasn't even at that point totally clear. I knew it had something to do with like the 7 times in Daniel and whatever, but I wasn't totally clear on that. So I dove into, well, how did they even arrive at that in the first place? And then I was like, oh, so they took a scripture in Daniel, made up some math that led to 1914. Like there's no actual scriptural evidence that supports that. And then when they went on to the overlapping generation, and I was like, whoa, wait a second, now it doesn't even it makes less sense. And so then that was at the point where the critical thinking really started firing for me. And especially since for work, I mean, for the last like 15 years, I've been in business operations and analysis. And so, you know, a lot of what I do professionally is based on very hard data and facts. And I think that's when that side of my brain clicked on and was like, okay, no, you need to go at it from this point of view and see, you know, where it leads you. And I think it only took maybe 3 or 4 days, and I had completely dismantled it in my brain.
That's crazy.
And I was just like, nope, this isn't even it. My whole life is a lie.
What about like the Isaiah book, the Isaiah's prophecy book? It was the 2 volumes that was being studied for book study when I left. And now I can't remember when it was maybe 2015 or so, where it was discontinued. You couldn't even get it anymore because so much of what was in it didn't line up with what witnesses believed anymore. Did anything like that ever hit you? Or did you ever see it or notice it or question, like, why is the Isaiah's prophecy book not being distributed anymore?
No, I mean, I remember the 2 volumes, and I remember even going through it, but I actually don't recall it not being really available or sort of discontinued. So no,
Must have
I
just
was
been
just
done really
going to
quiet.
meetings, studying and commenting and taking in the information. Like there wasn't anything that ended up being a red flag for me.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
I think that was done pretty quietly too. I mean,
Yeah.
it's not like the organization's going to announce it. Hey, don't read this book anymore. We have to change things because, and I think a lot of it did have to do with the 1914 thing and the overlapping generation and the changes there. I don't remember exactly, but I remember when that happened, and I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, and then when you go back and start seeing the things that they glossed over, changed online, it started making sense to me. Oh, they went digital because you can just edit whatever material you want at any time. And so, like as an example, since they've allowed clinking glasses and saying cheers, I took a screenshot of it really quick from their website because I assumed that it would be changed. That there was I think it was a questions from readers, what happens at witness weddings, and it said, will there be clinking of glasses? And it said no, because of the pagan origins. Well, they've changed that now. So, you know, so the governing body apparently can cure whatever is pagan.
Yeah.
And all of the changes that have happened in the last few years, because I had so much going on, like with mom and dad, I didn't really pay super close attention to a lot of that until I watched the Royal Commission, and then it was like, oh, beards are suddenly allowed. Sisters can wear pants. Like what? No counting of service time. Like that was the criteria that they based
everything on
what you could do on. And just with the, you know, one announcement, they completely got rid of that after 100+ years of counting service time.
Yeah.
And so then all of the changes just sort of solidified for me, like, oh, that this is just, you know, and if you follow the court cases, you can kind of see why they're making those changes based on the problems that they're having in other countries for human rights and that sort of thing.
Yeah, and the way they're sort of hemorrhaging people now. I mean, really for probably the last 10 years. Once technology came out, there were more and more people talking about their own experiences online, and it's all accessible. Of course, people are going to sometimes you hear somebody's experience, and it's actually the first time that you feel a sense of validation that, yeah, I thought the same thing. Whereas if you're going to meetings and you're talking to people about it, you're never going to get validation for anything. It's always going to be, well, I think you're probably losing spiritual strength or something like that. Maybe you just need to study more and read these publications and whatnot. So it's actually it was a huge relief for me when I found some, even years later, to hear that people were thinking the same thing I was, because I was always alone when I was younger, for the most part anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And so what, you ended up finding sort of the same thing, where you thought you're having doubts and somebody else is having doubts, and it was the first time where it wasn't a threat to listen to it, and it kind of made sense, sort of thing.
Yeah, definitely. And you had recommended a couple of YouTube channels, when I first said something, and so then at that point, then I was like, what are others' experiences? And then I started thinking about the disfellowshipping and actually how cruel and hypocritical it is, because if you go inactive, especially as a male, the elders are basically on your doorstep reading scriptures about not isolating yourself from the congregation. But then if they think that there's a reason to remove you from the congregation, then they're going to force isolation on you.
Yeah.
And they're going to take away your whole social network and your family. And when I started thinking about it that way, then I was like, wow. And then doing some research into how many people had unalived themselves because of it, because they couldn't handle it. And they want it to be a self-fulfilling prophecy, that everything that they've told you about, if you leave the organization, you're going to get into drugs and sex, and you're going to live a life of debauchery. And, they want that to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. And if you completely cut off your family and friends, where are you going to go from there? What are you going to do?
Exactly.
So
yeah, I remember that as a kid. Like, the whole thing was, you just wait for the person who leaves to hit rock bottom. You want them to hit rock bottom, because then they have nowhere else to go but to come back. But that they're not coming back because they believe it's true. If they left because they didn't believe it's true, they're coming back and then have to go through sort of this humiliation ritual because they decided to leave at a certain point, and the only reason they're back is because they have nowhere else to go.
Yep, that's right. And they want their relationships back. And
they want their families back.
Even if you're reinstated, I don't know that you're ever looked at the same way.
I don't think so.
I think there's always sort of a judgment there.
There's always a cloud hanging over you. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
It's pretty sad, really.
It is. Yeah. And so those were the things that I hadn't considered before that started running through my mind too, of what are all of these people dealing with that have left. And so I spent, a solid 4 or 5 months just consuming as much information as I possibly could.
Man.
And then after a while, I'd never set out to create any content, but after a while I was like, maybe if there's more voices to be heard, maybe it'll be more difficult to ignore.
Yeah.
And so maybe I need to jump on the bandwagon. And so I actually turned completely apostate. Now, I guess to back up a little bit, my wife and I wrote disassociation letters in January. And I know there's a lot of people that have the stance, well, why would you play by their rules? Why write a letter? Why not just go away? Well, in a lot of circumstances, that probably works pretty well. But in our circumstance, where we're back in a small area where we've known people in the neighboring congregations for so long, we just wanted a complete severance, and just mentally to say, no, this is our decision. We're going to disfellowship the congregation of Jehovah's Witnesses, and we're going to leave.
Yeah.
And so I actually wrote out a disassociation letter, not for them, because I assumed they probably didn't pay too much attention to what I put in there, but more for me to say, here's a why, and to re-solidify that. And then my wife just sent a text message and said, I no longer want to be associated with the Witnesses or be known as a member or volunteer, publisher, whatever. So we completely cut it off at that point. And then when I decided to try my hand at some content on TikTok, then I was like, okay, I'm full on apostate. But what I'm realizing is that apostates are actually whistleblowers.
Yeah.
They're the ones that know too much, and so the organization has to vilify them.
Mm-hmm. And reduce their voice as much as they possibly can.
Yeah, which happens in any organization that has a whistleblower.
Yeah.
You know, they just figure out different ways to make you seem crazy or conspiracy theorist or an apostate.
Or like I remember always being told it was something like Satan's really gotten to you. I remember being told that when I was like 16, 17. It's like, boy, Satan's really gotten to you.
Yeah.
I was like, I don't think so.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm that important, you know. I seriously doubt it. I'm just thinking differently than you are.
Yeah. And that's why, and I think that's why, and I'm glad you said that, because I think that's why on the content that I've created hasn't been personal experiences. I mean, I have made a couple of videos where I'm just talking about how I was a witness and why I left, but the majority of all of the content comes from the organization's own videos or their literature, or court cases, and that was the kind of solid factual information that I wanted to focus on. And I love the others' personal experiences, but for me, it was just I want to put out some very factual information, and if it helps other people, probably not those that are physically in and mentally in, but if anybody's having questions or doubts, or they're ready to leave but they don't have that quite solidified in their mind, then I thought maybe it'd be helpful. And I've gotten so many messages of appreciation for things that I've posted because it backed up what they were thinking. So that's been a really good experience.
That's awesome. That's good, because now you're the person that's sort of bringing validation to other people's thoughts and doubts, probably.
Yeah. And if they're completely mentally in, of course, there's nothing that's going to sway that. But there also isn't anything at this point that I feel like I can't debunk. And I think that's the real threat to the organization, is when you have people that have been completely mentally in, and they were freaks about studying and preaching and being able to, to give the message in a clear, concise way. When they leave, they know so much about the inside workings of the organization, especially with, having dad as an elder. I had a lot of conversations with him about processes and policies and stuff. And so I think that's one of the biggest threats to the organization is when those kind of people leave, they know so much, they can debunk it a lot easier.
Mm-hmm.
And they know what kind of questions to ask them.
Yeah.
So
yeah, but then you have the people that are super mentally in. And I remember when I was a kid, there was the saying that I would rather be wrong with the organization than be right with the world. And there's still going to be people like that too.
yeah.
And they're going to be mentally in no matter what, especially when you've been bought in for so long. I mean, I consider myself fortunate to have gotten out when I did, but for people who've been in for 30, 40, 50 years, or even in your case, all 38, 39 years up until you came out of it, like that's a huge amount of your life that you look back on and you're just like, what else could I have done? And it all unravels, and it's not an easy place to be. That's for sure.
Yeah.
So it's harder the longer you're in.
Yeah. It's like the rug gets pulled out from under you, and then you have to question your whole belief system, which means setting aside a lot of ego too, especially as a witness, because you're fully convinced that you're part of a specialized group of people that have, special knowledge. You're the only ones that have the truth. And so when that goes away, that's a lot of ego that has to be set aside to first admit that, well, not only is the organization wrong, but I've been wrong my whole life too, about something that I've been fully convinced of. And then you start having the questions like, well, who is God? Well, wait, is there even a God? Well, what about the Bible? Well, how many different translations and how many times has it been interpreted? And how do we even know it's inspired by God? Just because we've been taught that it was. And so, for me, it was like working my way completely backwards and dismantling everything.
Yeah, I did the same thing, not until years later, but it was definitely it was like therapy in a way to go back. And like for me, I just went back to the very beginning of Christianity and learned about the ecumenical councils and when the original church split and the Roman Catholic Church became its own thing, and then you had the Protestantism became a big thing, and I went all the way back and went through the entire history, and that made a lot of sense to me as to why. So I got to the point where I thought there's no way I could be a Christian ever again if I were to join an American-made version of Christianity, because it's ultimately a Protestant thing that somebody like, who was the founder of the Witnesses? Rutherford?
Charles Taze Russell.
Russell, yes. Yeah. Thanks. That he read the Bible and came up with his own interpretation of it. And that's like, yeah, there's no way I could ever go down that road again.
And what's funny is that probably most JWs don't even know that Charles Taze Russell wasn't the original president of the organization. It was a guy named William Conley.
Yeah.
And so that's an interesting read if anybody wants to look into that. But he has a very brief mention in the Proclaimers book, but they kept that pretty well hidden. And then, of course, when Russell died and Rutherford took over, it turned into a completely different organization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But yeah, I did the same thing, going back to William Miller and the Millerites, and then how everything branched off, and it was like this massive movement of religion all of a sudden in the 1800s, and yeah, it's an interesting rabbit hole to go down.
It is. Yeah, it kind of completely changes your entire perspective because you have a much bigger picture of the entire history as opposed to just this one very tiny lens that's carefully curated into how you see things.
Yeah, that's right. Well, awesome. Well, I think we're at a good point to wrap up. I really appreciate you joining me. I did want to ask one final question. What would you say is important to you now?
Family, for sure. And just, I mean, I want my kids to be raised with a strong moral foundation the same way we were, but in a different way. But definitely family, sticking together, because I mean, we all live far apart. And I mean, even with you and our other siblings too, because we all have our own things going on now. We're separated, but sticking together, and especially with all of our shared history and experiences, I think families need to stick together now more than ever. And that for me is it. Also, career-wise, I mean, I've been pretty invested in my career for a while. Being involved in the community more too is definitely important to me, more now than it ever was before. And I think just being more involved, more active with people that you know and you love is definitely the most important thing there is.
Yeah, I would agree. Awesome. Yeah, and maybe down the road we can have another conversation, get more into like family and extended family dynamics and more specific experiences and that sort of thing. But
yeah, some secrets could come out.
Yeah, that's right. Secrets and stories, and yeah, I'm sure we would have those for days.
Yeah, for sure.
But awesome, man. Well, thanks for joining me. I think it's a good place to end, and we'll see everybody next time on the Safe Space channel, and we'll have another guest. Thanks, Seth. Hope you have a good afternoon.
You too.
All right. Bye.